So without further ado, let me introduce Paul Wiffen, who's going to talk to us about all the magic stuff he's been doing over a long, long time.
Can you bring the lights down for dramatic effect? Thank you. So I don't think I need to tell any of you what that was, the introduction to the opening credits of Blade Runner. I chose to do it today on the Hydra synth because it's got the ribbon controller, and Vangelis used to use the ribbon controller not just for his trademark trail-offs that you heard at the end, but he preferred the ribbon controller to introduce vibrato. He called it human vibrato, as opposed to an LFO, which is how most of us get vibrato on synths. So he would just wobble his finger in the center position. I was doing a very bad impersonation of it there. So I had the good fortune to be introduced to the Greek maestro early in 1982. That's why this talk's called 40 Years of Sound Design. It was actually a wonderful chap called Francis Mandin, from Music Land, now called Audio Land in Paris. And any of those of you who read the liner notes on albums will know that that was where the Friends of Mr. Cairo album with John Anderson was recorded. I think Vangelis is still the only person to record an entire album in a music store. So it wasn't a recording studio. They brought tape machines in, but what Vangelis wanted to be able to do was use any of the 40 or 50 synths that Music Land used to sell, and they were the importers of Sequential, Oberheim. So basically, Francis had hosted the recording of that whole album, and then he turned up where I was doing a demonstration at Alexandra Palace and said, by the way, if you want, I'm going to see Vangelis tonight. Do you want to come? Which had to be the silliest question that anyone has ever asked in their entire life. When we got there, Vangelis wasn't there. This was not unusual. Many of the great artists I've worked with seem to have no notion of time outside of tempo. And so we were wandering around with the sound engineer looking at stuff. And as Vangelis walked in, Francis pointed out that Vangelis was using an Elka Rhapsody for strings. And, this is Paul. He's just been launching the new Elka synth at Alexandra Palace today, which, apart from a very nice dinner that we then went out and had, won me an invitation back once the trade show was over to show him this wonderful new Elka synth. When I played him the sounds, he loved it. But unfortunately, as soon as he sat down and started playing it, his first thing was, there's no touch sensitivity. So that was the end of it. I thought, okay, he's not going to buy this because, he wants, clearly being a CS-80 man, he wants touch sensitivity. But fortunately, Vangelis was thinking outside the box, and he said, do you think you can make some of these sounds on my CS-80? So I said, well, I'm happy to have a go. So he left me alone for a whole day, and I sat there desperately trying to recreate what I'd done on the Elka Synthex on the CS-80, and I was overjoyed to find that he thought it was good enough. And so for the next month or two, I would go in from time to time and try and make sounds on the CS-80 that fitted the score he was working on, which turned out to be Blade Runner. I didn't even know that the chap who came in a baseball cap every so often to listen was Ridley Scott. This was, a marvelous thing for me because I'd probably gone to working for one of my top 3 keyboard players. The previous year, I'd been going around the country with wasps and gnats, trying to make them sound like the sounds I wanted. And then suddenly, through working for Elka on the SynthX, I'd been catapulted to the very top of the industry. And I ended up working on 6 different films over the years with Vangelis. The next one was a very entertaining time in New York. It was for The Bounty, which starred Anthony Hopkins and Mel Gibson. And the instrument that I used there was the brand new prototype of the S900. Vangelis had used the original emulator a lot on Blade Runner, but for whatever reason, he didn't particularly like the emulator 2, and so he was looking for another sampler. And I flew directly from the NAMM show in Chicago, where I'd played some of the very first sounds on the S900 to dealers there, straight to New York, and this Hotel Pierre, where in typical Vangelis fashion, he'd taken over the entire top floor of the hotel. This was necessary because they couldn't rent the rooms to anyone else, because Vangelis would get up at 3 a.m., have a musical idea and insist on playing it very loudly. The great thing for me was when we'd finally finished the first evening's work, I said, "Oh, by the way, Vangelis, where do I sleep?" And he said, "Any of these rooms, the film company's paying for them all." So the next morning I got to wake up and the Hotel Pierre overlooked Central Park. So I had my breakfast on the balcony overlooking Central Park, which was fantastic. There's hundreds of other stories I could tell you about Vangelis, but we do have to try and get on to other people. So as I say, I had never seen a CS-80 when he asked me to look at it, but when he said, "Do you think you can do the same thing?" I went to check for 2 or 3 things that the SynthX had, I thought, uniquely, but one of them was ring mod, and the CS-80 had that. So it all came out in the wash, fortunately. So I was still working for Elka at the same time, so there was quite a few days where I went to show other artists the SynthX during the day and then went to the studio in the evening, because like most artists, Vangelis was basically nocturnal, if not vampiric. And so you did everything at night. The only problem was that next day I'd be driving around trying to find a music store or an artist's studio, falling asleep in the car. So it was an interesting time, but I was only 25 at the time, so it's a lot easier than trying to do that sort of thing now. Some of the other people that I did SynthX programming for were Geoff Downes of Asia. Actually, Asia bought 2 SynthXs, one for Geoff and one for John Wetton, because John Wetton said, "That looks a lot easier to work than all your other synths, Geoff. Do you think I should get one as well?" So there was a lot of songwriting done on it, as well as pretty much all the strings on the third Asia album are my string sounds that I originally did a couple of years earlier for Elka. The great thing about the Elka was that it had chorus, and I remember having a huge argument with Dave Smith of Sequential, who later became my boss. He said, "Italians have to put chorus on their synths because they sound crap otherwise." And Dave held that belief for 30 years, but I did notice that effects started to creep onto some of the later Sequential products. But yes, there was another guy called Mark Stanway who was then playing in Magnum and is now touring the country in a tribute band to Magnum called Kingdom of Madness. And I just recently got him this new Elka-X soft synth plugin from Cherry Audio. And he said, "Oh, that's great. I can finally get my SynthX sounds back," because he'd sold his at some point along the line. So the great news for anyone who wants to make SynthX sounds is that there are now finally some choices after me badgering people for the best part of 40 years. First of all, I tried to get Elka to make a rack version. They didn't, but finally a company called Black Corporation in Japan finally produced the Xerxes. And my good friend Jed Allen, who's been helping me no end getting this together, has been kindly lending me his Xerxes. And we'll be looking at breaking down the Jean-Michel Jarre sound on that a bit later. But the one that I'm most excited about now is a $39 plugin from Cherry Audio called Elka-X. And the reason that, it's not that I don't love the Xerxes, it's that the Xerxes doesn't attempt to do the whole Synth-X. It does one voice channel. So if you want one Synth-X sound, then the Xerxes is probably the most accurate. But what it doesn't do is let you double the sounds. And for me, one of the great things about the Synth-X was that you could double sounds on it. It also had a sequencer, which the Elka-X perfectly reproduces. So I'll be playing another piece later on which uses the Xerxes sequencer. And that for me was, the magic of the Synth-X was the totality of the voice architecture, being able to get two of those voices at the same time, either split or layered, or one running on the sequencer and the other running on the keyboard, and you know, the sequencer itself. So my hearty advice to you is, if you can't afford $4,499, which is what the Xerxes 2 is going to cost, then spend $39 with Cherry Audio, because it really is extremely accurate reproduction. And I'm just in talks with them to recreate all my original factory sounds for them. So I hope that at some point in the future you'll actually be able to say it is a complete replacement for an original Synth-X. Of course, if you've still got $10,000 to spend, I'm told there are quite a few Synth-X's going for that sort of money on eBay and reverb.com. So the last person that I got to program the Synth-X for was someone I'm sure you've never heard of, called Stevie Wonder. He was kind enough to ask me to come and work on his new album. This was 1986, and the album, when it came out, was called Characters. The first song that was released, and it was released early enough to win the R&B Grammy Award in 1987, was a song called Skeletons. Nobody ever recognizes the name of this song. I don't know why. As I say, it did win an R&B Grammy in America. But when we hear it, you will instantly recognize it from one of 3 or 4 places that it's been used over the years. But we're going to play a little game first. At the beginning of the video, Stevie actually plays the song how he wrote it on the piano. So I'm going to ask them to just play the first 4 bars of Stevie on the piano on its own and see if any of you recognize it. Does anyone recognize that song? It's not really surprising, because the version that came out, having won an R&B Grammy, is extremely different. Then you're going to see a movie it was used in, and then for all you gameaholics out there, you'll see a video game that it's been used in. But first, I'm just explaining why I'm playing the video. It was done using an Elka Synthex, a Prophet 2000 running a wall bass sample, and an Oscar, and all MIDI together and then recorded into the synclavier. And therefore, it was a little bit impractical to try and rig that up for you today. So we have a bit of the video, then a movie it was used in, and then the video game.
He is not staying the night. So
that song had quite a long lifetime. It was recorded in '86, won a Grammy in '87, was in, I hope you recognise the greatest Christmas movie of all time, Die Hard. I think that was '88 or '89, and then it sort of went into hibernation, but came back in 2012 with a bang with Grand Theft Auto 5. So I hope you'll excuse me not attempting to reproduce that live for you, but as you can imagine, a synclavier, even to play back the recording off the synclavier would be tricky, but a Prophet 2002, an Elka Synthex and an Oscar all in the same room, you'd have to get security in to make sure that they weren't going to get stolen, because they're all so bloody valuable these days. That all happened before I met Jean-Michel Jarre, but around that time I was sent by Electronics and Music Maker, which the older people amongst you will remember was what we had to manage with when Sound on Sound didn't exist. In fact, Ian Gilby, myself, and quite a few other writers got a free transfer from Electronics and Music Maker to Sound on Sound once Ian started it. They sent me very kindly to interview Jean-Michel Jarre for the launch of the Zuluk album, which, if those of you who know Jarre's work well, was with what I call his Fairlight period. And it was absolutely chock full of Fairlight samples and stuff. At the end of the interview, which you can still find on musines.co.uk if you're interested, as we were getting ready to leave, Jarre said to me, "So are there any new synths that I should be looking at?" And I said, "No, but there's an old one. It's called the SynthX, and I can get the French distributor to lend you one if you like to evaluate it." So that happened, and then I completely forgot all about it till a couple of years later. I was lying in a friend's garden, and they said, "You like synth stuff, don't you? I've just bought this album. See if you can guess what it is. Put it on." And in the middle of the second track, my SynthX sound came blaring out, as I later discovered to be triggered by the Laser Harp. And basically, Jarre had gone off, listened to the synth, liked it. I believe he now owns 3 of them, which makes him independently wealthy just on that basis. But he loved it, and I was amazed to find that for the rest of his career, he triggered sound Bank 4, number 6, as the only sound he has ever played from a Laser Harp. So there's an awful lot of people out there who think the Laser Harp sounds like that. Well, of course, the Laser Harp doesn't sound like anything because it just sends out MIDI. But he chose that, and I'm very humbled that he decided that was the futuristic sound that he wanted for the Laser Harp. And one of the things that I discussed with Paul Gilby when he very kindly booked me to do this talk was, he said, "Now you will be showing how you made the Laser Harp sound, won't you?" And I said, "Well, it's only 40 years ago, but I think I can remember." I don't know if at this point we can get the camera onto the panel, because it will help if you can see. Can you see anything there except for my badge? Is that better? So the SynthX, and therefore the Xerxes, has 3 unique features, and it's why it's so bloody difficult to get it on any other synth. In about 2011, some very nice French people called Zills Labs invited me over to Paris, and we tried really, really hard to get this sound on their version, their tribute, I would call it, to the SynthX, which was called the SynthX, although at some point they changed the sound, they changed the name. I can't remember what it's called now, but it's still available on their download page. But it didn't do the ring mod, and this sound does require ring mod, cross pulse width modulation of the oscillators, and the ability to do a fixed glide. So instead of a portamento, just a quick lesson for those of you who don't know, portamento is where the note slides from the last note you played to the next note you played. Glide is where you set a fixed interval for, in this case, oscillator 2. And what happens is that oscillator 2 starts at that fixed interval and then slides down to the original oscillator 1 pitch. And without that, you don't get the same timbre on every note that you play. So the amount of pitch shift in oscillator 2 is controlled by the distance from the last note you played. So if you play the note next to it, it's very short and quick. And if you play a note a long way away, it takes much longer to get to it. By using the glide on the SynthX, I can set a fixed interval. I think in this case it's an octave. And oscillator 2 will start an octave higher and slide down to the same pitch as oscillator 1. So what I'm going to do first is turn off the glide, turn off the oscillator cross-width pulse modulation, and turn off the ring mod. And that's what the SynthX sounds, with all the right settings for the Laser Harp sound, except for those 3 things. So if I now turn on the glide, it's starting to get there. If I now turn on the cross pulse width modulation, that gives that crunch at the beginning of the sound that makes it a much more percussive. And then the ring mod does what ring mod always does, which is introduce some frequencies that normally you wouldn't expect to find. So and that, in a nutshell, is why it's almost impossible to create it on any other synth. Now, I was able to do it on the CS-80 for Vangelis, but he ended up not using it on that soundtrack. But it didn't work quite as well on the CS-80 because the CS-80 doesn't let you set a fixed amount of glide for the sync to then slide down. So I hope that's given a little bit more of an insight into how that sound was built. If you want to talk about it some more, that's one of the things we can discuss on L2 a bit later on. I will be trying to see if I can trick the Laser Harp into working there so some of you can try it. But if not, we can discuss anything else like that, or you can just tell us some great stories about Vangelis and Stevie Wonder, because there's a million of them. These 2 very quick anecdotes. So 2 of the other people that were kind enough to let me loose on their equipment. After I'd worked for Geoff Downes on the 3rd Asia album, one of his roadies, a lovely guy called Spence, went to work for Keith Emerson. And Keith Emerson was trying to catch up on sampling, because to that point he'd never used it at all. And in the end, I took Spence set up for me to take Jeff's Emulator 2 down to Keith's Manor House in Sussex. And Keith was very keen to try out sampling in his new setup. Unfortunately, Keith's understanding of sampling was that he was going to be able to make really great synthesizer solos out of A, his chickens, and B, his Kawasaki 1000 motorbike. So I spent most of the day crawling in the chicken coop with a microphone. And guess what? When we laid it out on the keyboard, it really wasn't anything anyone was ever going to want to hear on an Emerson, Lake and Powell album. However much I filtered the Kawasaki, it just sounded like the end of the universe. And whichever note you played didn't really affect it. So again, it was never really going to be a great sound. So that was the end of sampling for Keith Emerson, really, and I don't think he ever really used it. What did happen while I was down there was that a tractor driver, and we've never quite understood whether he was drunk early in the day or distracted, but he drove through the side of Keith's barn, which was his rehearsal studio, and took out the GX1. The GX1, for those of you who don't know, was kind of a precursor of the CS-80, but it was more like the pilot station of the Starship Enterprise than a keyboard. You sort of sat in it, the bench was built into it, everything was built into it, and you sort of sat in the whole thing. And very few people ever got them, but Stevie Wonder had two, because Stevie Wonder has two of everything. Keith had one, John Paul Jones of Led Zeppelin had one, and an obscure Dutch guy called Rick van der Linden, who was the brother of the Focus drummer Pierre van der Linden, actually made an album with Jack Lancaster, the British wind player who used to use the Lyricon. And one of my favourite albums of all time is called Wild Connections, and if any of you haven't heard it, you can dial it up on YouTube now, like most things. It's Rick van der Linden and Jack Lancaster's Lyricon. But most people know the GX1 for two sounds. The orchestral strings on Village Ghetto Land by Stevie Wonder on Songs in the Key of Life. And by far and away the most famous track was on Works by Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and it was the hit single Fanfare for the Common Man. One of the things I had hoped to show you was how easily you could reproduce that on a SynthX, because you could double brass and strings and it gave you an almost perfect recreation of the GX1. Many of you may have seen a video on YouTube of me with long hair, which is a bit distressing in and of itself. But I do show exactly how I recreated the GX1 fanfare sound on that. I was going to show it, but I think time is taking too long, and you really don't want to see the Paul Wiffen of 1996 when he thought long hair was still cool. So the last thing that I want to cover is to go back to Blade Runner and use the closing titles to illustrate just how good Cherry Audio's Elka-X sequencer is. So I don't have a keyboard to load it in from, but you'll have to trust me that playing the da is as much as hitting record on the sequencer, playing those four notes, hitting stop, pressing loop and pressing play. I'm going to be using Logic, which sadly, apparently these new Macs aren't very compatible with the system, so we can't run it up there. But all Logic is doing to start with is playing a single note to trigger that four-note sequence. And we're using the clock in Logic to control the clock in the Elka-X soft synth. So I haven't loaded Logic with da-da-da-da. I've loaded the Elka-X with that. And what Logic is doing is sending a transposed note every so often, because those of you who know the closing titles will know that that same four-note phrase, which I think he originally did on an ARP sequencer, if I remember at the time, which had the same ability via, I think, a control voltage to change the pitch. That is what Logic is doing to start with. So I've added a few parts in later. So this is just really to give you an idea of how good Vangelis was at using really quite primitive equipment then to make the sort of things that we would just knock out in Logic or Cubase these days. So he was really a visionary with, you know, other people would have said, well, what can I really do with a four-note sequence? But he could easily see how it could become a core part of the song. So I'm sorry that was a bit of a mess, but at least it gives you some idea of how that was put together. All the samples, the tubular bells, the timpani, and the bell tree, he would have originally done on the Emulator 1. Anyway, so that's pretty much everything I was trying to show you, not necessarily in the right order or even all the right notes, but thank you so much for bearing with us. And next time, I'm going to insist we do it outside so the laser harp works. Thank you very much.